So a minute on this chart. And on the bottom you see a URL where there's a whole booklet goes with it. It's not that it's the best way, but I want to take a minute to talk about what are we doing under attack that looks just like yours. And thank you in advance for those of you who will be at the Verizon store. As we've been in this fight for over a year, including a 2-week strike of 40,000. And right now, trying to negotiate with the help of the director himself for 10 days of the Federal Mediation Service meeting in his office. And these attacks are all the same. So this is called democracy and economic justice, which you all know so well. And on the top part, you see economic justice. President Obama has modest goals that we support, but they're modest. Fairer taxes, infrastructure, as you talked about in Anaheim when you were in the streets, public services. In the middle, the CWA, because this is part of our education, but this could probably be you just as well. For 6 years, we've talked about our fights at bargaining and politically, mostly in terms of these 4 issues. Secure jobs and fair trade. That's fighting contracting out. That's fighting trade deals that offshore our jobs. 500,000 call center jobs, not just manufacturing, offshored in the last 5 years. This fight for jobs, whether it's Postal Service jobs or the jobs at Verizon, where 10,000 technical and call center jobs have been shipped to Asia, and that is one of our major demands in that contract, or the fight for manufacturing jobs. We need to put those who we elect on notice. Don't talk to us about jobs and then come to us with cuts. Don't talk to us about jobs and then come to us with cuts. And all too often, we hear this from this administration as well. And as you've talked about this week, the president's opposition is much worse on every one of these issues. The second one, health care for all, where again, we worked with NALC for a decent health care bill before Affordable Care Act was passed. And we passed in the House of Representatives legislation that went far beyond the Affordable Care Act. It called for every employer in this country to provide the kind of health care that you have in the Postal Service, that we have at most of our major employers for hundreds of thousands of our members. And as I'll talk about in a minute, that legislation passed by the House by a 60% margin did not get discussed for 1 second on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Or retirement security, where we have to fight for the pension. And I heard the conversation here about how they, quote, overfunded the pension and then use it to say they're broke. But every one of our negotiations, including at Verizon, where right now, a year after that bargaining started, they still want to cap pensions at 30 years. You work more than 30 years, you don't get anything more. That's a way of dumping workers, because the members will then feel, why should I keep working here? And then they don't replace them. But more importantly, across this country, only 20% of working people have pensions of any kind. And Social Security remains under attack. As Fred said, most importantly, number 4, bargaining and organizing rights. Every letter carrier here I know understands, and hopefully our 600,000 members, but we need to go deeper with this, because Most of the people we elect have totally forgotten this. That without bargaining and organizing rights for America's workers, there is no hope, none, to ever turn this economy around. No hope, none. We must stand up and fight back for our bargaining and organizing rights like brothers and sisters did in 1934. And if that means we go out together, we go out together, because one by one, they will steal our rights, one by one. And again, the House of Representatives, not in this session for sure, not in this Congress, but in the last, by a 60% margin, adopted and passed in the first 100 days of that Congress, the Employee Free Choice Act. And as Fred said, did not get discussed for 1 second in the U.S. Senate because of the way they operate. And then on the right side of this chart, you see what we call partner issues, those we need to work with, to build the movement that you see on the bottom here, the coalition of labor and partners, 50 million strong. We can build that kind of movement. But we do have to reach out broader, embrace those partners so that they are there for us as well. We do have to build new kinds of coalitions, as you said today, as you've been doing for years. Because those partner issues, as they are beginning to learn, Greens that fight for climate change, or young kids robbed of the American dream that fight for the DREAM Act, or civil rights and other groups fighting wave after wave of housing foreclosures. This is all part of economic justice that we believe in. We are all blocked by this blue wall that we call on this chart the limits of our democracy. And you know these issues, I won't go through them in detail at all. But the way the billionaires, Koch brothers and many other billionaires, have taken over our political system like never before. And Fred, when we talk about the global economy and the global democracies, there's not another democracy in this world where money has a grip on the political system like this one. You will hear later from our brother Ruben Cortina from from Argentina. When he was a young activist, he had to go underground because of the repression there. And many were jailed at that time, some 25 years ago, or left the country. Same story in Brazil and Chile. But today in Argentina, today in Brazil, 35% of workers like us have bargaining rights. And in the United States, it's 12%. And that difference is all the difference in the world. And that's the reason why our democracy continues to decline, as our bargaining rights are crushed, and as money takes over this political system like never before. And number second on that wall, the Senate rules. No other democracy in the world operates with rules like this Senate. Whether it's the Employee Free Choice Act or the health care we fought for, you end up with crumbs when you make it through the Senate. And I was glad to hear Harry Reid, the Senate leader, finally say, late but not too late, I might add, that if the Democrats control the Senate again, if they have a majority next year, he will lead that majority in changing those rules. And number three, voter suppression. And we heard earlier proudly from a brother from Fred State, Florida, talk about absentee voting. But Florida is one of the 38 states that have passed some of the worst voter suppression in this country. I recently watched a YouTube video where a teacher talked about how she had registered her civics class, senior civics class. She turned in the voter registration forms in Florida and was fined $1,000 because a new law they passed in Florida is that if they're not turned in 48 hours, you get fined $1,000. And that civics teacher had to pay that fine. That's not what democracy looks like. And recently I marched from Selma to Montgomery as we reenacted that march from 1965 when Martin Luther King and so many others marched for voting rights. And last year in Alabama, legislation was passed that most recent immigrants in Alabama are not able to rent an apartment. They can't sign any contracts. They can't buy a house or a car. And their kids are the ones who can't go to school. And many of us will say, well, our families came here legally. Why can't they? Well, I don't know about your families, but I know my family history. And they didn't come here with PhDs, and they came in the bottom of ships. They came with nothing. And when they got off the ship, in 5 years, there was an easy path to citizenship. Not what we do here today. The same people who put the billions of dollars into politics, the same people who want the Senate to never be able to pass anything that we care about, the same people like the American Legislative Exchange Council that has sponsored 38 states passing voter suppression laws. Those same people don't want to see 10 million immigrants get the right to vote because they're working class people and they know they'll vote with us. And so, what this is about is that while it may be harder than ever before, it's not hopeless. And we have to build a movement, which we can do, of 50 million uniting workers in unions, workers who want to be in unions, civil rights activists, those who fight for climate change legislation, young dreamers and their families, those who are fighting foreclosures. We have to build that movement at our workplaces with education. We have to build that movement in 2012 when we vote. And when we vote, we make choices. And I know you will be considering an endorsement in a few minutes, as we did in our own union. And we have to understand that we don't have the movement in the streets we need so that we can elect the people who will fight for the social change that we all want. In the meantime, if we sit home, as in 2010, if we don't carry the message that we heard in that first 7-minute video about the differences between the Romneys and the Obamas, if we don't understand that on Romney's list is to eliminate what's left, which is almost nothing, of private sector bargaining rights, he'll do that in the first 100 days. And while we're disappointed and angry about the Board of Governors of the Postal Service, and I'm angry too, talking to Fred last night and listening today, I'm angry as if I was a letter carrier. Why don't we have a Board of Governors appointed by this president that stands up for the Postal Service, that says we can deliver? Why don't we have that Board of Governors? Why don't we have congressional leaders, particularly from the party that we have supported, that stand up in our fights? Why are they silent when we have to fight with Verizon, a $100 billion company with billions of dollars a year in profits, just to hold on like we're on the side of a cliff to the health care and the retirement that you're fighting for at the Postal Service, while we're fighting for our jobs, holding on to a cliff? Where are they? They're there when they want us to support them. And we get frustrated and we get distressed. But deep in my heart, I believe the answer to that is what Fred said to me last night. We have to vote smart based on the choices in front of us. And then, at the same time, the railroad that runs on 2 tracks. We have to build a movement in the streets that we saw in Madison, that we saw in Cairo, that we saw in Tunis. We have to build a movement in the streets like we haven't seen here in Minneapolis since 1934, or in San Francisco, or in Toledo, or wherever letter carriers have a branch. We can't do it alone, as Fred said. We can't force others, even if they're in unions, postal or otherwise, to join us. But those of us who share your values, not just these red shirts, we're ready, sisters and brothers. We're ready to stand up and fight back. Fred joined us on, we have the third Thursday of every month, we have a town hall call, not on bargaining, but on our sisters and brothers in CWA and other unions and other organizations that are out on the streets. And we listen to those reports from frontline workers for about 20 minutes, and then I say something at the end for a couple of minutes. And Fred joined us and talked about this postal fight some months ago. And our members do believe it's our postal service that we're fighting for. And we started those calls when young students, graduate student workers, had taken over the Capitol in Madison. And we've done them every month since. Because we deeply believe that as important as every fight we have, and believe me, we have hundreds of gigantic multinational employers who our members have to work for, as well as public sector governors that are almost as bad as the ones here in the Midwest. But we've learned that as important as each of those fights are, if we're not there in a new way for each other's fights, willing to take some risk, willing to use up our precious time that's hardly any of it left because of the fights we each have, willing to mobilize as we probably haven't done in generations, that is really the only path. That's this blue arrow that says 7 to 10 years. The only way we move that path is, on the one hand, when we have chances to build a political movement like this election, we use those chances. We don't get discouraged and give up, and it becomes even worse if we do. But we also have to build with more resources than we ever have found this movement in the streets. And I thank you so much for the commitment to be there at the Verizon store, and our 3 leaders who are here with me will be there with you. I have to go to Cleveland, where we had a tragic death of our regional leader. He drowned while on vacation last week. In the middle of, anyway, I'm not going to talk about that. It's too hard for me. But like we all do, we have to carry it on, and that's what Seth would want. So I'm sorry I won't be there, but they will be there with you. But today it's the Verizon store. Tomorrow it's our members at the post office. For those who are here from New York, there's a lockout now that's in its 4th week at Consolidated Edison. 8,500 workers, the same kind of cuts you are facing. They're locked out in the largest union city in this country with more than 1 million union members. And I talked to their president, Fred, almost every day, told him the same thing, that the day may come here in the next days or weeks. And we will raise this at the AFL-CIO Executive Council next week in a closed session, where we need to say to each other, I never worked at Consolidated Edison, but what they're fighting for is what I'm fighting for. I'm not a lineman, I'm not a utility worker, but what they're fighting for is what I'm fighting for. And we're all boxed in these narrow little boxes. So every time we stand up, it looks like it's just us instead of justice. And the day may come even in these weeks ahead where we say as union sisters and brothers, in this case in New York, we're going to stand up and fight back, and we're all going to go out in New York City, and we're all going to surround those generation plants, and we're going to make sure, because all of us are there, that no scabs will get in that day, and we will send a message loud and clear to the governor of New York that he better stand up and fight back too, because we're tired of being split up, we're tired of being divided, we're tired of these cutbacks, we're ready to stand up and fight back. And I mean this deeply. If you have actions at the post office, any place where there's a CWA local, ask them to be there with you. It's an honor to be there with you. If you have some national week where there's actions at the post office, I commit to you we will mobilize like it's our own fight. And I commit to you and to Fred that as we build this movement of 50 million strong together, we will do it together, whether it's in the halls of Congress, whether it's in the elections of 2012, or whether it's in the streets of every small town and large city in this country. What do? When they attack? We stand up, we fight back. We stand up, we fight back. We stand up, we fight back. Thank you.
What do you think of Larry Cohen? Larry, we got you a little gift.
It's not a hand sanitizer.
I think it's a cell phone. It's not Verizon.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
How about a letter carrier chair for Larry Cohen? Hip, hip. Hip, hip. Hip, hip.
Okay.
Thanks, brother.
Take care.